All right, guys, welcome back to another episode of Anchor's Points. Today we have a very special guest with us. You guys will remember Mr. Tyler Burnworth. He is in one of my most popular videos. Tyler is a writer, and he was on the show once before. We've had a chat. And Tyler, for those people that aren't familiar with your work, you want to just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, yeah. I'm a proud family man, a member of the Air Force Reserves, a science fiction writer, and an aircraft mechanic. And that's pretty much my resume. So.
And what about your website and stuff? You want to give us a little bit of details about that?
Sure, yeah. I've got a Patreon page. It's patreon.com/TylerWriting, where I post all of my short stories and even some sneak peeks of chapters from my upcoming novels.
Awesome, yeah. Yeah, and I'm subscribed to Tyler's Patreon, and you know, I've looked over his comics and I've read some of his short fiction, and I'm a fan. And Tyler and I are both huge fans of a comic called Invincible, and that's what we are here to talk about today. Invincible was created by Robert Kirkman, who many of you will recognize his name from The Walking Dead. He created the Walking Dead comic, of which the show is based upon, and he is a major figure in the comic book industry, especially in independent comic book publishing. With comics, usually people, average people know about Marvel and DC, but another major company is Image. And Image has created The Walking Dead and Invincible. And they were two ongoing titles that Robert Kirkman wrote every month, and both of them were excellent books. So today, we're going to talk about the first two trades of Invincible. And right off the bat, Tyler, do you want to just tell us some things that really stand out about Invincible that you love? Because you were just telling me a couple minutes ago that it's like your favorite comic. So why don't you tell us why?
Oh yeah, Invincible is my absolute favorite comic series of all time. It had 144 issues, which is major for a comic book to run that long. That's right. And it ran that long for a reason. The story is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, being a comic book fan myself, I expect certain tropes like Batman or Superman, certain things that you've seen done over and over again. And this comic book plays on those expectations. So things are not always as they seem. And there's been some issues that I read where, I've seen Superman in a similar situation like this. And then, bam, they just flip the script on you. And the surprises are what keep you reading. It's really interesting.
That's the whole thing. For people that aren't super familiar with comics, a regular issue of a comic usually comes out once per month. So right. For a book to come out with 144 issues, we're talking that's over a decade of time. And that's really impressive for a non-Marvel or non-DC book. And so Invincible actually first appeared in the Image book Tech Jacket, which was a miniseries that Robert Kirkman wrote. He showed up in November of 2002, and then he ended up getting his own regular series in 2003. And when Invincible first showed up, it was Robert Kirkman writing, and he had a different artist. It was Corey Walker, and they're the two creators of Invincible. And Corey Walker was just around for the first trade's worth of issues and a little bit of the second trade's worth of issues. And then he was joined by Ryan Ottley, who, Tyler, you're a fan of Ryan Ottley's work?
Yes, I am actually. Ryan Ottley is one of my favorite comic book artists, and I think that's from Invincible, but I actually have with me here one of my favorite cover pieces that he's done. It's for Pretty Violent. It's a comic book that was done by one of the guys who worked on Adventure Time. Actually has his own comic series with Image. And I mean, you can see his artwork is just, very graphic, and it's very interesting. So,
yeah. So that's one thing that we should kind of just say right off the bat is that one of the appealing things about Invincible is that it has the typical superhero trappings that you'd expect from a Marvel or DC book, where there's guys in capes and spandex, and in tights, but it just has this incredible graphic violence. And it has this color scheme, which is very vibrant and, in your face. And so the graphic violence is very jarring. And Ryan Ottley, like you can see from that cover, he, goes into full detail.
And he knocks it out of the park every time.
Yeah. Yes. So Invincible has this beautiful kind of mashup of, superhero lore mixed with soap opera melodrama also mixed with like incredible ultra violence. And there are hundreds of characters throughout the whole series, and many of them are super interesting.
That's the thing that I love about it, actually, is that you wouldn't think about it reading the issues just maybe one at a time, but one of the overriding themes of the whole series is family. You have a lot of different things going on with his family that really get explored in some pretty graphic ways, and it's actually a very emotional comic book when you get into it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so you know, you mentioned that it's about family, and it's funny because a lot of the titles of the trades of the book are named after family sitcoms from like the 80s and the 90s. And like even when you look at the very first trade, it's called Family Matters, like, you know, the Steve Urkel show. And then the second one is 8 is Enough. And that's not a coincidence there. Like Robert Kirkman knows, like he's kind of tying it in with that whole 80s, 90s sitcom, you know, because like you said, it's about family.
What really got me into it from the very first issue is it feels a lot like Spider-Man. You know, it feels a lot like Peter Parker, where you have this teenage guy who he's starting to go through some changes as teenagers do in their adolescence. And in Invincible, what's different from Spider-Man is his father is a superhero. For all intents and purposes, Superman. Right. Similar powers, similar position recognition, and things like that. And they really play off of that he's expecting to develop his powers sometime soon. He kind of has like a dead-end job at a fast food joint after school and things like that. Really boring life, but he's watching his dad save the world on TV every afternoon, you know?
That's right.
And I mean, it's just amazing to see, even in just the first trade, the arc that he goes through into becoming a superhero himself is very interesting.
Yeah. And with Invincible, it came out in a time in comics when I think comics really evolved. I mean, comics have obviously been evolving over the decades, and there was a major leap forward in the 80s. But for me, when I got back into comics, it was in the early 2000s. And in the early 2000s, I think that's some of the best comics ever. And Invincible is an example of that. In the early 2000s, one thing that became more commonplace in comics was telling a story without dialogue in panels, like having no sound effects and no dialogue, and just visually telling the story and having a bunch of panels without any kind of dialogue. If you look at comics from like even all the way up to the 90s, there is always almost like a word bubble, a narration, but Invincible is just filled with just shots of people's reactions or like some kind of graphic action happening. And I've always appreciated that type of storytelling, because the more you like, the less you tell, the less you literally tell, the more the reader gets involved, I feel, you know, and lets their imagination work.
Oh, yeah. I mean, comics are a visual medium. So when you have the images that capture your attention and they're in a sequence that tells its own story, there's no need for all those hanging word bubbles, for all that extra internal monologue and stuff like that from the characters. You save a lot of art space by not covering up with that text if you have poignant images to get that across.
Absolutely. And an example, a shining example of this, I feel like, is in that first trade when Mark first discovers his powers. So he's working at that dead-end burger joint that you're talking about, and he goes to go throw out the trash, and he goes to throw the trash into the dumpster, and he like throws the trash to like England, you know?
Yeah.
And to me, it's just, there's no dialogue whatsoever. There's not a narration saying like, oh, my powers have kicked in. It's just him throwing the bag, and it just flies off into space. And that always has stuck with me since I first read the book.
That is such a great moment. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love Invincible, how it focuses on those little moments, because that's a recurring thing later on with like certain other items that he'll throw, and then they end up showing up later. And there's just a ton of little Easter eggs like that.
Yeah.
It's great.
Yeah. And that's the beauty of a book that is told with the same creative team for like almost 144 issues, you know, is that they have all these little jokes, these little references, things that happened 20 issues ago that'll all of a sudden come into play. And it's a real treat for the fans.
I really, speaking of Easter eggs, there's kind of two of them that I wanted to get into real quick. I was an indie comic creator at the time when I started reading Invincible, and I was using a lot of it for inspiration, art style-wise and things like that, with the art direction with my artists. And I appreciated the fact that most artists you either pay per page or per panel, And there's a specific reference when Invincible goes into a comic book shop, and he picks up a comic book, and he says something like, "Oh, I hope this isn't one of those issues where they're trying to skimp on money," and they recycle a lot of panel artwork.
That's right.
But that whole sequence is the same panel artwork as
right.
he's talking to the guy. Yeah.
Right. Yes, absolutely. I love that. There's all these little winks, you know?
Yeah.
And before you were saying that, you know, Mark Grayson reminds you of Spider-Man, and absolutely he does, right? But then his last name is Grayson, just like Robin, and then eventually Nightwing too, you know,
right.
Dick Grayson. So it, like, Invincible is a love letter to the superhero comic industry.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, and it's so good. And so, like, you know, it's almost an ironic thing that his dad is based on Superman, and for his whole race, the Viltrumites, they all look like Superman. They all got dark hair, and the thing is, though, is that most of them have mustaches.
Yeah,
that's like their discerning feature.
Yeah, that's why I'm laughing. It's like the craziest calling card of a superhero, you know, the mustache.
Right. Why don't we talk about some of the supporting characters, some of the characters that support Mark?
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, they kind of form their own little Teen Titans thing in the beginning. He stumbles across a group where they have Adam Eve, who's like the sexy superhero female dressed in the pink, kicks a lot of ass, you know.
Yeah.
And then you have like the tech guy that's Robot. He's an actual robot, and he's kind of like the brains of the operation and things like that. You have Rexplode, who is sort of modeled after the Flash and maybe like the Human Torch a little bit from Fantastic Four. Yeah, there's a lot. I can't remember anybody else.
Well,
I know there's more.
Right. So as you said, there's Rexplode, and I kind of feel like he's got a little bit of Gambit in him too, right? Because he like charges things to like blow up. Yeah. So the other one too, there's what do you call it? Her name is Duplicate.
Yeah.
Right.
Forgot about her. Yeah.
So she can make copies of herself. She's kind of similar to a female character that's on the Legion of Superheroes from DC. So you have Robot, Duplicate, Rexplode, Adam Eve. And what's cool about Adam Eve is that her power essentially allows her to just create things, you know? She's kind of like Green Lantern, but she can actually make tangible things versus just constructs.
Right.
And she's extremely powerful when we learn more about her as the series goes on. And what we find out is that Mark and Adam Eve, and her name's just Eve, they both go to the same high school together. And once he develops his powers and he runs into the teen team, he makes that connection that she's this girl from his class. And they start to become friends. And while they're in school, they're talking about their superhero exploits. And their school life kind of becomes entwined with their crime-fighting life, too. And in the first trade, there's a little thread that's going through the first trade where there's students from their school that are being turned into bombs. And it's interesting because in the early 2000s, it's an interesting thing to put into a book because it's like fresh off of 9/11, but it's not in the current climate that we're in right now. And so I think that's kind of a risky thing to make a book about guys getting turned into human bombs. What do you think?
Oh, yeah, definitely. With the 9/11 thing, and then Columbine was only a few years before that, so just school violence in general, I think it was a pretty risky move for Kirkman to do that. Yeah. But I think he kind of knew what he was doing because it's hitting on the times, like the zeitgeist at the time, something that people would actually be afraid of, you know? Absolutely. We might read it nowadays and be like, oh, like that's kind of like a cheesy storyline or whatever, but at the time when it was coming out, it was very relevant.
Yeah. And it's interesting, too, because you find out, and I'm going to have a little spoiler for the first trade. You find out that the person that was making these students into bombs was actually the parent of a student at the school, and he was an engineer. And his son had killed himself because he had been bullied. And so the dad was going around and making students into bombs and having them blow up in malls, too, of all places. So right off the bat, you have this fun, lighthearted superhero storytelling, but then it also has this sort of gritty, real world issues like stuck in there too, you know? And that's, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, that's the dynamic that makes Invincible work. You have the balance between like the very graphic, dark violence, and then it's counterbalanced with these lighthearted, funny moments or these touching family moments. And that is just really powerful when you put them together.
Yeah. So within that first trade, there's also this other sequence where the dad, Omni Man, is fighting an alien invasion. And the aliens aren't from outer space. They're actually from another dimension. And he needs Invincible's help. So Invincible flies in. Both of them are fighting. And they notice that the aliens are starting to age really rapidly. Well, before they can finish off the aliens, Omni Man gets sucked into their world and he's gone. And Mark is left without him for a couple of days. And it just goes along with what you were just saying right there, that it's all about family, because we see how having a husband for a superhero and a son for a superhero affects the mom. And you want to just tell the readers about, the viewers about the mom too?
Yeah, so the mom is like your model mother. She's like very supportive of the dad being a superhero, very supportive of the son coming into his own as a superhero. And that's where the soap opera elements sort of come in, and it's done very well, is you see her struggling with, oh, dad's gone, or the husband's gone for days, weeks. I think there was an incident where he was gone for 6 or 7 months because he got stuck in some interdimensional portal. Right. And she just carries on as a single mother until he comes back, you know?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I mean, who can't relate to that? I know my dad worked a lot when I was growing up. So that hits me like, wow, like this is a situation I'm familiar with where dad's gone. And to every son, or most sons, like your dad is a superhero. He takes care of you. He provides everything you need and things like that. So it's very relatable.
Absolutely. Wait, was your dad in the Air Force too, like you?
My dad was Army, yeah, career Army.
Oh, okay. Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
So he definitely is like a superhero. Yeah,
Oh,
absolutely.
yeah, to me, yeah.
So Mark is on a team. He's on the teen team. And the dad is also on his own team too, which they're known as the Guardians of the Globe. And they're basically like a DC Comics, you know, they're like the Justice League, basically. And within the second trade, we get introduced to them and his role on the team. And they have a counterpart for Wonder Woman. They have one for the Flash. They have a Batman counterpart. And that's where the title 8 is Enough comes from, because altogether, the Guardians of the Globe are 8 members.
The Guardians of the Globe, they each have their own powers, like you said. They each are sort of modeled after some of the DC superheroes and things like that. But then there is Omni Man. It represents sort of like a Superman from the DC universe, is kind of like the leader and in charge of them. And in the second trade, he calls in, well, someone calls in a meeting for all of the Guardians of the Globe to get together. And at that point is where the comic takes a very drastic change. In my opinion, and I don't want to get melodramatic here, but in my opinion, it is the greatest twist in comic books. And are we going to reveal it now, or is that going to be later?
We can reveal what happens in that trade. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in that trade, it kind of gives you a brief introduction to each one of them, and you're like, okay, like this is going to be like a Justice League sort of thing. They all gather up together, and then one by one, they just all are murdered.
Yeah.
And as you're turning the pages, you're like, who could be powerful enough to take out the entire Justice League for all intents and purposes? And then when you flip to the last page, you see Omni Man, you know, Mark's dad, covered in their blood.
Yeah. Totally gruesome. And the way that he kills all of them is super violent, super quick too. Just they're all dispatched right away. Yeah, and that's the big reveal. It's like, whoa, the dad killed them. And so the thing is that at that point in the story of Invincible, you're not sure what the heck is going on. You know, the dad, he was gone for a couple of months. Like maybe the invaders messed with his mind or something. So no one's sure exactly what's going on. And you learn what happens with the dad in the next trade. And I think that Tyler and I will talk about that eventually down the road too. But
absolutely.
We didn't really talk about the dad's race that much. You know, we
should. How he kind of has the sit down with the son. Like, let me tell you a story. This is where I'm from.
Yeah.
And he's from the planet Viltrum. All of the males on his planet look very similar to him with the mustaches. They're all Superman style, like perfect bodies, ripped and everything. And the females are war fighters too. They don't have mustaches, but they're badasses in their own right, you know?
Right.
And that's what they do. They're guardians of peace and justice throughout the galaxy, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so their mission is to go find planets that have gotten to a certain stage in development. But it's interesting because in that trade, he says they haven't reached a certain point where there's like no hope for them. So I guess they're implying that like certain civilizations, you know, destroy themselves. And so they can go and join that society and help them if they're like at that turning point. And so Omni Man, and his name is Nolan in the book, the dad, he wants to go to Earth. He becomes obsessed with Earth and he wants to go there to basically help humans. And right away, he's just like saving people like the first day that he's there. And he builds up a legacy and a name for himself. And one of the things that Dad does for his secret identity is that he writes books. And he's a well-known author. Because that's how he provides for his family. And so what does happen, though, by the end of the second trade is that the Guardians of the Globe are dead, and the dad is not saying anything to Mark about it, you know, like that he was there. And they go to the funeral. And what I really liked about the funeral was that it had other Image characters there. And are you aware of the other Image characters, Tyler? Or?
To some extent, yeah, a little bit.
Yeah. Like for those of you that know Image or not, whatever, some of the characters that stand out in that volume, there's Shadowhawk, who is one of the original Image characters from when they first started. He's kind of like a Batman type, but he's got the silver metallic kind of suit and red eyes. And what was interesting about him at the time when he came out in the early 90s was that he was African-American, that was different from Batman, obviously. And then also, I believe he had AIDS too, or HIV. So Image, when it first came out, it was very like gritty and in your face and hardcore. So they were like, okay, let's make a Batman, but he has AIDS, right? So he's going around as a vigilante breaking people's backs. Then another character, do you know the Savage Dragon?
Oh yeah, Eric Larson. Yes.
Yeah. So as I was saying, Eric Larson is another creator at Image, and he has been with the company since its inception in the early 90s, and he's still working on a comic called Savage Dragon. So we're talking decades of working on the same comic, his creation. And Savage Dragon, you guys will recognize, he's this green character, looks kind of like the Hulk, but a little more trim, and he's got a big mohawk, a big green mohawk made of his dragon skin. And he was at the funeral too. So it's cool to see these Image characters in Invincible's in this funeral scene in Invincible, you know?
It really ties in. Invincible does that. I've read some other Image comics, but I have never seen one that does it this well, where they'll go interdimensional or even just in their own natural universe, and they will run into all kinds of other Image characters. I remember one of the issues I saw a panel with Spawn in it.
Yep.
I mean, they tie in everybody, and it makes perfect sense. It's very logical. It makes it feel like a real lived-in place when you see all these connections like that.
Yeah. And Image itself is super interesting to me. Just a little tangent, a little history for people. Image came out in the early 90s when comics were really booming. And comics were really booming because people found out that the old comics were worth a ton of money. So that people would buy like 4 or 5 copies of brand new #1 issues. And so all the all-star artists and writers from Marvel decided to go over to form their own company. And so they formed Image, and Rob Liefeld, he's a real famous artist. He made the book Youngblood. And then Eric Larson, like we just said, he made Savage Dragon. Jim Lee, who's now at DC, who's incredible, he made Wildcats. So these are all Image characters, right? And they all had Marvel and DC type characters, but they didn't do as cohesive a job melding them together like Marvel did or DC. And so what's interesting about Invincible is that Robert Kirkman has done a really good job, just like you said, Tyler, taking these different characters from all different worlds and stuff and putting them into one universe, you know? And that just gets me real excited because I always felt like Image could have had its own superhero universe, but there was not a person to kind of bring it all together. And
Robert Kirkman, he stepped in and did that. And if you look at it now, it was a couple of years ago, they actually made him a partner in the company. So they have a panel on their partner board. They have like 7 or 8 artists, Todd McFarlane, people like that, Rob Liefeld, and Robert Kirkman is the only writer on that board.
That's right.
And that's because of what he was able to do with Invincible, Walking Dead, all kinds of stuff like that he's done for that company. So.
Yeah. And another thing, too, that's really interesting is that Image has changed since its conception in the 1990s. And now it doesn't really have superhero comics. Now it's like all different types of genres. There's sci-fi, there's crime stories, there's definitely horror stories. And it has some of the most famous titles, you know, like The Walking Dead, obviously, but then also Saga is another real famous one. Do you know any other Image books?
Ones that I'm a fan of right now is Oblivion Song. That's another Kirkman one. And interesting for him is that that's more of a teenager one. So there's not a bunch of F words and things like that. It's still pretty graphic, but not too much to where teenagers wouldn't really be able to read it.
Yeah.
Pretty violent. That's one of the artists from Adventure Time. I really enjoy that comic book a lot. They did Black Science. Rick Remender is a great comic book writer. He has Black Science, Deadly Class, all kinds of really great comic books from him. Seven to Eternity.
Yes. Oh man, the art in that is so good.
It really is.
Yeah, and Rick Remender is one of my favorite writers of all time. I love Rick Remender, and he makes all this stuff for Image, you know. And so what's interesting though is that Robert Kirkman once had a manifesto in like the probably like the late 2000s, where he made a couple of videos on YouTube, and he was saying to the people in the comic book industry, listen, what you have to do is you have to have established writers and artists making their own creations like they do now at Image, right? And you should have no-name people work on the books at Marvel so they can get established, and DC. And it's interesting because he made this manifesto and a lot of people made fun of him, but I do kind of feel like the comic industry has just kind of naturally done that, like what he was suggesting. So,
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you see the success of Image alone. They're an independent company. They're independent of Marvel and DC. And then you'll see like Marvel Zombies, like they brought Kirkman in to do that.
Right.
And he started off as an individual creator, and then they bring him over to do that. You know, it's like his model ended up being very successful, and it works, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that like around the time that he made that manifesto, he was writing at Marvel with the Marvel Zombies, like you said, and they did have him doing like Marvel Team Up, and I think he wanted Spider-Man, and they didn't give him Spider-Man, and I think that's why he just stuck with Image and just stayed like exclusive with them. And what's interesting about that, just a little another tangent, is that Ryan Ottley, who's this amazing artist on Invincible, is now the current artist on Spider-Man, and he's just killing it over there.
He is, yeah. Yeah. There's actually a cameo in one of the Invincibles with Spider-Man. That's actually a pretty funny incident. So.
Oh yeah, like a little crossover action, yeah.
Yeah.
And you were talking about crossovers before. There's a time when Invincible crosses over with Walking Dead too.
There is, yeah. That's such an interesting thing because with The Walking Dead, there's a brief little backstory that Kirkman pitched it to Image as the zombie apocalypse is actually a precursor for an alien invasion. And that's kind of the originality of that idea is what sold them on it. And then he abandoned that plot line. But I think it was issue 25 where he kind of made a callback to that. And there was like some hints dropped in there. And then in Invincible, there's an issue where a spacecraft crashes down and there's two police officers that go to investigate it. And it's Rick and Shane from The Walking Dead.
Oh, what the heck? All right.
Yeah.
I did not know that whole alien invasion subplot.
I could talk all day about the crosses between Walking Dead and Invincible. So there's a superhero comic that Mark Grayson in Invincible likes, and it's Science Dog.
Right.
And in Walking Dead, the TV show, you can see Carl's shirt has the Science Dog logo on it. That's the little paw with the radioactive stuff around it.
Right. That's all. I think in the Walking Dead show too, they're like they have like minifigs of Invincible people. Like they have like little figures of them in an episode too, of like Alan the Alien and Omni, not Omni, Adam Eve. You know?
Yeah. And there's a scene in one of the episodes, I think it's in season 6, where Carl is reading a comic book, and at the time it was an issue of Invincible that hadn't been released yet. So they just have all kinds of Easter eggs like that throw back and forth.
That's awesome. You know, and I just mentioned Alan the Alien, and you know what? We didn't talk about him at all because he's in the
second we didn't. Grade. And I have a theory about Alan the Alien, actually. I don't know if you follow Robert Kirkman on Twitter and Dwayne Johnson, The Rock, but there is a live-action film already optioned and being worked on for Invincible.
A live-action Invincible, really?
Yes.
Oh, I did not know that.
So that's already happening. Seth Rogen is involved with it, which is very exciting for me.
Oh, okay.
Additionally, though, Robert Kirkman put out a tweet about how one of The Rock's movies, I think it was the new Calvin and Hobbes, when that came out, he said, "Oh, this is such a good movie. Like The Rock does a really good job." And then The Rock commented on it and said, "I can smell our universes crossing soon," or something like that. And I was like, dude, Alan the Alien, he would be perfect for that, you know?
Oh my God, yes, he would. He absolutely would. Because Alan the Alien, just like Adam Eve, goes on to play such a major part throughout the Invincible series too. You know,
Oh yeah.
Yeah. People
So
are watching. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. If you didn't know about the live action thing, did you know about the Amazon animated series?
That I do know about. Yes.
Okay.
Where the guy who plays Glenn on the show, what's his name?
Steven
Yes.
Yen, yeah.
It's so funny because I forget his name, but I love him. He's awesome. He's so good in The Walking Dead. He's so good in this movie. Shoot, I can't remember this name, but it's like a horror movie where like the office people go crazy. He's awesome in that. And then he's also a guy in Voltron too. He's also Keith in Voltron. I love him. But
yeah.
he's Mark, right?
Yeah, he's going to be the title character, yeah.
That is so cool. All right, so I just had to look up the movie that Steven Yeun is in that I really love. It's called Mayhem. And it's a real good movie. It's on Shudder. But he's just awesome in that. And then also while I was doing that, I remembered, who plays J. Jonah Jameson, who's going to play Nolan. It's J.K. Simmons. He's going to play Omni Man. Yeah.
That dude is so good, man. Whiplash. He's done so many good things. He's going to be great for the show.
We were talking about live action version and animated version. I think that what'll ultimately happen is if it's an animated season, it'll probably encompass these first two trades that we just talked about and probably the third trade, which like the third trade pretty much sets the tone for the whole rest of the book. You know, there's something that happens in the third trade that it just changes the whole game. And we're not going to spoil it because we want to maybe talk about all of these in order. But I think, Tyler, would you agree with me that probably if they made a live action movie that they would do the first two trades worth of story, take some stuff out, and that would be like the first half of a movie. Then you would have the events of the third trade, which would be like the turning point of the movie, right?
Absolutely. I think it would end with the immediate aftermath of the big reveal in the third trade.
Yeah. So like when the third trade happened, that was big news in comics. And it's kind of funny that we're not talking about it, but I think that in itself is worth the episode, of a show, of us talking.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it affected me so much for, artwork on a piece of paper, like sequential artwork, that really affected me a lot. I say Star Wars is what got me into writing, and Invincible with this twist is what got me into storytelling.
Yeah.
The shock, absolute shock I had knowing that a superhero story could pull out a twist like that, and it's an emotional one. It's something that I thought about for days, weeks after. And I've been trying to get anyone who could potentially read comics to read this and tell me how they feel about it. It's that devastating.
Yeah. And that is a really great point, because if you like superhero comics, or if you're interested in comics in general, Invincible is a very accessible series if you start from book number 1. And here's the thing. I've read it all just from going to the library, or I used to buy all the issues myself. But if you go on Comixology and you get Comixology Unlimited, that's included in Comixology Unlimited. So you can just get every issue by just paying $6.99 a month. You can get like the first 10 trades of Invincible for free, And I know I sound like I'm like shilling for Comixology, but it's totally worth it. If you want
any way that you can get it, you need to read Invincible. It is pinnacle comic books.
Yes, definitely one of the most important comics within the past 2 decades. That's for sure.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So, was there anything else that you wanted to talk about, Tyler, or do you think we kind of covered everything?
No, I think we've hit all the major points for the first 2 trades. I'm just really looking forward to getting into the spoilers for the third trade. That is the meat of Invincible, and it's what that single twist is what carried the whole 144 issues of this comic series. It is amazing.
Absolutely, yeah. So, I guess that's it. And we can meet again maybe within like a week or 2, and we can discuss maybe trades 3 and 4.
Absolutely, yeah. I love the show, Pete. I love the show. I watch every episode now. You got me hooked, and you're a great dude, man.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I appreciate it. And we're actually going to be working together come November. Tyler is actually putting together an anthology with a bunch of up-and-coming writers, and he's been gracious enough to let me contribute a story to that anthology. So I'm super stoked about that.
I'm stoked to see what you come up with. A little bit about the anthology. It's called Paper Grove, and it's going to be indie writers of 2020. And basically the criteria is like nobody that's a professionally published author. It's all to showcase what ability and talent is in the writing community right now that is not recognized or noticed by professional publishers and things like that. And there's a lot of great talent out there, you know? And I wanted to gather some of that up and offer up a really strong anthology with all different genres. There's going to be a bunch of short stories, and it's going to be probably 2 or 3 short stories from genres like sci-fi, speculative fiction, romance, literary fiction. It's going to cover the whole gamut of the writing community. And I'm really excited to get that out. 100% of the proceeds are going to be donated to help writers in need. So that's writers who can't make their mortgage that month, or writers who they've lost their job due to what's going on right now and everything like that. It's tough times for everybody. Yeah. So anything that we can do to give back to the community, especially from a very talented pool of unrecognized indie writers, you know, get together and do it.
That's awesome. Very noble. I like that. I appreciate that. Okay, well, so then if you guys enjoy this, then Tyler and I will be back within a week or two, and we will be talking about future issues of Invincible.